You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about exciting, creative, and innovative ways of living. Produced in Santa Barbara, California, Sustainable World focuses on positive solutions to environmental challenges, solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics, earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe, how to plant a food forest, restorative design, or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned to Sustainable World Radio. I'm Jill Cloutier. I'm Jill Cloutier for Sustainable World, and my guest today is Paul Kephart, and we're discussing living roofs, living architecture, and biodiversity in an urban environment. And welcome to Sustainable World, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be on today.
It's a pleasure to have you here. What I would love to start with, Paul, is you just sound like you are a jack of many trades, and I'm wondering, how did you get started in this work?
Well, actually, I'm disciplined as an artist, and I like to draw and sketch and work in the design realm. And as a part of that design, I focus on environmental and ecological sciences. So it's an integration of art and science, and I think that's what brings spirit to the work that we do here at Rana Creek.
And could you tell our listeners, Paul, about Rana Creek?
Sure. Rana Creek is located in Carmel Valley. We're an integrated products and services company with about 50 employees, and our work focuses on environmental planning and ecological design, and we are also growing native plants for restoration and sustainable landscapes. And we have a great team of people here that are committed to contributing to the ecologies of the world.
Well, it sounds like it, and I know in your talk you were talking about the green roofs and living walls, and is that the type of work you do at Rana Creek, a type of living architecture?
Certainly. This trend in urban planning and development is focused on improving the site conditions and the ecological function, as well as the quality of life for the many creatures that inhabit the urban world. And as a part of our work, we have focused on site-specific ecologies and how we can understand and bring back the plant communities, the plant assemblages, the natural processes that once occurred, and we're focused on doing that within structure. So I think that's what differentiates this new era of architecture, is that we're looking to enhance biodiversity and ecology within the built environment.
And I think that that's definitely something that's been left out of the discussion of the built environment for quite a while.
Well, our population, as it expands, for instance, the population of California may in fact double over the next 40 years, and that will have a significant impact on natural systems and open space. And we now have megalopolis, these immense land masses that have been converted to impervious concrete and steel and glass. So our challenge is, how can we protect and maintain and sustain biodiversity within the trend that's occurring now, and that's this massive explosion in population and land development.
Now, Paul, in your brochure, your Rana Creek brochure that I got at the Green Roof Symposium, it states that, and this is a quote, "Every square foot we develop to homes, offices, and municipal buildings is another square foot we take away from the plants and animals that help sustain our lives." Now, why do you think that that has been left out of our current way of life and our current way of building?
Well, I think for a number of reasons. We come from a very recent culture, some 250 years of the past, that thought that resources were inexhaustible. We come from a frontier mentality and a pioneering mentality, an opportunistic ethic extractive agriculture. We're focused on immediate return. Our economies are based on exploitation and extraction, much to the detriment of culture and society and a healthy planet. And I believe now, and I'm encouraged, that people recognize the significance of the changes that have occurred and how that's affected our quality of life for future generations, and that many people are recognizing the need to change those patterns. And I'm encouraged because I see the restoration, the science of ecology will drive new economies that are based on contribution and sustainability.
Yes, it's almost like America's been stuck in an adolescent phase for 200 years.
Well, indeed, we're growing up. It's time to focus on the future and focus on how we can contribute. And what I also see and recognize is that many people's values have changed, and I think the commercialism and materialism that much of America has focused on will rapidly change, and people will understand and benefit from a more simple lifestyle. I see this in the young people that I work with now, is that they're more interested in a quality of life than the material and consumerisms that perhaps affected earlier generations.
One question I had for you, Paul, was that do you think that this current kind of eco-green chic, it's kind of the in thing now to be green, and I know that Vanity Fair called green the new black, and the New York Times is saying green is the new red, white, and blue. Do you think that this could be a shift that's going to be a deep and lasting change, or do you think it's just a hip trend that's kind of going to fade out eventually?
Oh, no, it will manifest itself in many, many ways. This is not a trend or a style or a chic. I do believe, though, that there's a little bit of that going on. I guess the term is the greenwashing term. Mm-hmm. But that's good, too. I think it focuses the media and the populace on positive terminology and a positive message. When we think about the health of the planet and the health of our communities, the health of the environment, it relates to the health of our culture and us as individuals. And I think well-being is something we all wish to have in our lives, and that comes from a connection with nature.
Now, Paul, have you always had this connection with nature, or as a child, was that especially important for you?
Oh, yes. I grew up in the very rural Midwest and moved to California when I was 19, became a naturalist painter, and most of my life has been spent out of doors, and I live in a remote location. I love the culture and the excitement and the vibrance of cities. And what I wish to do, though, is to bring some of the values of open space and natural landscapes to cities so that those folks that have been disconnected to natural areas can feel that connection.
I've read, too, and I think you might have mentioned this at the Green Roof Symposium, that since the 1920s, the amount of pavement associated with each new dwelling has grown 5 times. I think it was about 5 times. What do you think, since you're talking about your connection with nature, out in open spaces, how do you think this lack of green space, what has it done to the American psyche and those dwelling in the urban centers?
When I was visiting Los Angeles, I heard a man speak about his childhood there. And he said he loved his backyard, and they actually had a lawn. And it was soft and spongy and moist. And
I remember that.
And it made such an impression on me that the lawn in a backyard was the only connection with a soft, alive space. Los Angeles, for instance, has 68% of its land mass is now impervious. Mm. And so we're going to reverse those trends. And also because of this urban density and increase in population, the ground plane it's taken up. We need that space for people. And And those hard surfaces that convey our businesses and our enterprises are necessary. And I think that's why this trend in living architecture looks at available surface. So roofs provide a great deal of surface to vegetate, provide soil and plants and water holding capacity, as well as the walls. And I'm also seeing that we're now looking at integrative design where roofs and walls and stormwater management systems can be combined. For instance, roofs will retain 70% of all rainfall that falls on the site.
Paul, could you describe to some of our listeners may not know, what are green roofs?
Well, green roofs are green, and I like to call them living roofs.
Yes, because a few people, sometimes people think it's just you're talking about the color green.
That's right, and I think the green movement ought to be called the naturalist movement because it's also referencing a color. However, the green roofs or living roofs have been around for quite a long time, but the science and methodologies have been perfected in Europe over the last 50 years. They're quite popular and common in Germany and Switzerland. For instance, in Canton, Basel, Switzerland, it's mandated when you destroy some of the land mass or the ground plane that you put back some of that ground plane on the roof.
We could use some of that here. I think U.S. cities are starting to join that trend where aren't they mandating or rewarding people for building sustainably?
Certainly. There are incentives for building with green measures, low-impact development, recycled material, the natural fibers and materials that don't have toxics, solar energy. All these are part of the sustainable design movement to decrease the impact of development on our environment. Living roofs or green roofs have been now in Chicago, for instance, Washington, Toronto, Seattle, and Portland, Minneapolis. These subarctic areas, the technologies are fairly straightforward and they're quite popular, and Chicago leads the country as one of the top 10 cities for having green roofs. The challenge for living roofs, that's why I call them living roofs, is that when you're in an arid area like Palm Springs or Las Vegas or Phoenix or San Diego, for instance, Santa Barbara. Yeah, these arid lands where you have seasonal rainfall, then you have to look at an ecological reference or plant communities that are adapted to our cool season environment where we get our rain and then in the winter months and then we may go 175 days without rainfall. So defining sustainability on those roofs is an important aspect of that kind of design, and they're not necessarily green all the time.
Well, that was one of my questions. I wonder if clients who want a living roof would go for a brown roof for 3 months of the year in a place like Santa Barbara.
Well, the roof could be brown or blue-gray or go through a season of flowers. But if we think about integrative design, we produce a lot of gray water in our structures that the roof could act like a big biofilter and utilize that gray water to help transevaporate that water, but also maintain a green or a living, non-dormant roof. Utilize the gray water, and which is really a key to sustainable design, is reuse. And by doing so, we gain 78% efficiency with the energy used by that building. We can demonstrate through research that with living roofs, the interior of the structure is 15 degrees cooler in the summer months. That's a big energy savings.
Especially in a dry climate, hot.
Hot and dry equates to lots of air conditioning, and that's one of the other benefits of living roofs is that we can decrease energy use Another benefit is sound attenuation, in that a building that has a living roof, the soil and the plants absorb the lower decibels by 40 decibels, and that's like taking a very busy highway sound and reducing that sound to like the sound of a little refrigerator motor, for instance.
That's amazing. That would be very helpful in urban areas. Are living roofs similar to the old sod roofs that you would see maybe in Ireland or England years ago?
Yeah, that's the idea. For the same kinds of reasons, in Ireland and Finland and Northern Europe, the local people used the building materials they had at hand, and living roofs were often moss and ferns, and wood and clay was used, clay primarily as waterproofing, or like tiles, and then the moss and the plant material would be grown, and that would shed water and insulate the structure and keep it nice and cozy in the winter months.
Are there now, I remember at the symposium people were talking about there were two different types of green or living roofs, extensive and intensive. Could you tell our listeners what the difference is?
Yeah, we're involved in a number of designs, residential and commercial and monumental architecture, that involve both extensive and intensive. And these terms were brought forth from Europe, and they're quite commonly used there. And extensive is shallow soils, lightweight growing mediums with succulents or grasses or forbs that grow with very little water and maintenance. And usually they cover the whole surface. Intensive, on the other hand, can range from decks and living space, and while we've got some designs where people have actually put little golf courses and parks and soccer fields. I mean, use your imagination and consider that this other elevation can be used for playgrounds, food production. For instance, in Los Angeles, we've helped the city of Los Angeles with their new council district headquarters in Compton that has a beautiful park for people and an amphitheater and a nice place, a safe haven for people to get above the city streets and still enjoy nature and have a nice place to be. So that's more of the intensive type. Intensive roofs can also hold water, and there are actually streams and ponds and waterfalls, and so you're only limited by your imagination for the idea of living architecture.
And it makes sense to go up because we have there's so much of the built environment in cities, and we can use that area to regreen the city landscapes.
Well, there are a couple of visionary artists, and like Huntavasa and Malcolm Wells, that looked at earthen structures and vegetated structures, and that occurred in the 70s, and now many people are starting to see the benefits of those structures and vegetation as part of that built environment, and it's being realized now, those visions.
One of the things that was a highlight for me at the Green Roof Symposium was when you were talking about providing places for migratory birds and invertebrates. And the speaker after you mentioned how he saw Canadian geese landing on one of your green roofs, and I believe that might have been, I don't know if it was Chicago, I'm not sure what he was talking about.
Yeah, that was in Vancouver at the library that Cornelia Oberlander designed. And as an ecologist, now you're getting to the mission and the focus of Rana Creek, is that we're hoping to stitch back those corridors and those the habitat values for migratory birds and invertebrates and butterflies. And we have projects up and down the West Coast that we've targeted specific migratory patterns and corridor utilization for, like the Smith's blue butterfly on the roof at Esalen Institute in Big Sur. And what we do is we recreate the nectar plants and the food larvae plants, and the constituents of the plant communities that were once present that will support a diverse assemblage of butterflies and birds. And this is very important where we have these large cities that have interrupted migratory patterns. There's no place for food and shelter along their pathways, so they may not make it along their journeys. And there are metapopulations of particular butterflies that we can understand that are still intact in small parks or open space. So our idea is to create these little habitat oases in between a right-of-way or a schoolyard or a churchyard or a park or an open space or a roadside, so that we can reconnect the pathways and the habitats for these creatures.
That to me was just, it's so inspiring, because I was imagining being a migratory bird, or, you're flying and flying and all you see are these buildings, and then there's a living roof ahead. And what an experience that must be for those birds. Well,
from a scientific standpoint, we also have to look at these as potential biological traps and make sure that the habitat that we produce doesn't end up it makes sure that once they get there, they have the necessary food and water for reproduction and shelter, and also that they're not exposed to predation. So when you start to tinker, although Leopold said when you take the watch apart, make sure you save all the pieces.
It's very true, because you wouldn't want, would predation occur if there were, the living roof was kind of seen as other animals as a place where birds are resting, and then they would start stalking there?
That's correct. So we have to be careful and thoughtful in the design process. And we're networked with a group of scientists in Switzerland and London. In London, they're looking at habitat for the rare bird, the red start. And in Switzerland, there are many invertebrate studies. And then we are looking at invertebrates and butterflies and migratory birds here on the West Coast, all the way from the Vancouver Convention Center, which is a 6.5-acre roof in Vancouver, and all the way down into San Diego and along the coastal migratory routes.
Paul, if you like, we can take a short music break, and then we can come back and continue the interview.
That sounds great.
Okay, we'll be right back. This is Sustainable World on KCSB 91.9 FM in Santa Barbara. What I would like to know, Paul, is what was your first project with a living roof? What did you first do?
Well, I was working as an ecologist, an artist in Big Sur, and a wonderful architect, Mickey Munich, was designing the Post Ranch Inn. And Mickey asked me to come and consult with him about the sustainable landscape and the kinds of plants we might use, and he showed me this beautiful little coastal prairie that's a very diverse plant community, and showed me where his bungalows were going to be located. And I said, "Oh, Mickey, we really need to protect this little habitat." And his answer was, "Well, why don't we just lift it up onto the roof?" And that was the first project that I had been able to be fortunate enough to collaborate on, and that really started the idea of just taking that reference, that ground plane, and then moving it right up onto the roof and supporting that same ecology that had occurred prior to putting in the bungalows.
Now, Paul, in our discussion, I just keep getting this image of how suburban America has all these lawns in the front yard. I wonder if we could just put mini lawns on our roofs and then plant edibles all around on the ground plane.
Yeah, certainly. We have a new project in Palo Alto with Bill McDonough's group, and it is a corporate landscape. They need to be, there's lots of impact and high density. A lot of people use them. They're fairly high maintenance, and our challenge is how do we get that amenity and function and still have a naturalistic landscape that supports the birds and the bees and the butterflies. And so we have incorporated some turf lawns and native grass lawns that use much less water and fertilizers and inputs, and then surrounded it by these wonderful plantings of California native flowers and herbs that support the types of invertebrate ecologies we're after.
sounds, too, that living roofs and living architecture, are you stacking functions? I know in your talk you were mentioning bioswales that are 3 stories high.
Well, we're looking at this from an integrative or regenerative design approach, which is really what ecology is about, is looking at holistic systems. We want to see all the elements of design. And so when we look at a living roof and we want to encourage stormwater retention and purify rainwater, then we can create a place on the roof with microtopography where water can collect and water can move through the system and be purified. And then in addition, that extra moisture can produce the biomass that would insulate the building and provide habitat. So what we try to do is create a design that provides a number of benefits within the same process or in the same program.
And it sounds almost like living roofs could act as like mini estuaries, or I guess they are like living bioswales.
Well, the idea of retaining and slowing the water down is not necessarily new within architecture. The soil will absorb a great deal of storm water, and then the plants, of course, are pumping that water from the soil and transevaporating it. So it actually completes that water cycle. If you think about the old diagrams we used to learn in high school about the clouds, the journey of a raindrop from the sky to the earth and how it is absorbed into the soil and the plants utilize it and then it's transevaporated back into the sky. It's that cycle. All we want to do now is just put a structure into the loop so that it's part of the natural process.
Instead of just being a separate, and it almost impedes it.
That's really the idea behind living architecture, is that architecture and communities become a part of nature.
Yes.
And our natural processes.
Now, Paul, a question I had for you, and it seems like a lot of cultures, if you go back to their indigenous roots, like plants and animals and insects, are recognized as having a place and an importance in the world and kind of a right to exist just for their own sake. Would you say that your philosophy of living architecture kind of encompasses those ideas that all life is important and maybe sacred, and that one of your missions in life is to provide a place and to hold a space for all creatures?
Yeah, we would hope that our land use planners and architects and developers and homeowners that we work with can achieve, learn, and appreciate a reverence for a particular place and all the different creatures and processes that occur there. So central to our work is to interpret the natural world and provide a way in which people can appreciate it, its complexity, the spirituality, how important it is to our culture and society. And once we achieve, if we can achieve that within land use planning and our social and cultural fabric, I think all these larger challenges, resource depletion and population and demand for energy that causes social unrest and war, I think that those kinds of things are manageable. We just need to get to a place where we understand the importance of biodiversity and our own niche, our own place, how important that is in the broader long-term scheme of where we're going in the future.
And do you feel like part of your work is almost observing the patterns of nature and then applying them to the built environment?
Yeah, we draw on Fukuoka wrote a book called Working with Nature, and he applied that to his permaculture, his gardens and orchards, and really we can learn from that. If we observe and watch nature and learn from those natural processes, we can see how a natural wetland purifies rainfall, and my friends at Natural Logic, Jane Bird and Gil Friend, often call this urban metabolism. That's how does the natural processes of the life-giving functions happen within the urban fabric?
And integrating and working with those.
Well, now, that's the key and the challenge. Also, in order to achieve some sustainable measures, often these solutions have some higher upfront costs. So we're working on the life cycle analysis and the economic side. And I've learned a long time ago the last thing you want to say to a developer or a person that's investing in a new project is that together we can save the world. We would really like to help understand the economic side of this because it's as important as the ecology and the spiritual side, that we have to make it work from a long-term investment standpoint. For instance, roofs, because these living roofs, because they save energy, that has a payback, and then also
water purification.
That's key, is that we spend so much money, the municipalities spend so much money on water infrastructure to manage and shunt stormwater away, that if we can just retain it within structure, that's a huge savings to our community.
So it's almost speaking the language that they can relate to.
That's important. It's really a part of the messaging that it's oftentimes I see projects, people want to do the right thing, and they have the discussion, it's the right thing to do, but then we also need to have the metrics and the science and the performance measurements in place in order to demonstrate that these techniques and design features can work for them.
Yes, it sounds like you actually have the science and the evidence and hard data to support your feeling and your passion for the natural world.
Well, our design work and our land use planning is rooted and based in science, and I'm developing a standard and guideline called LEAF. Mm-hmm. And you're familiar with LEED.
Yes, how does LEAF differ from LEED?
Well, LEED, while it does provide some credit for sustainable site development, LEAF looks at leadership and ecological applications and functions, and that, again, gets right down to the root of this issue about place and about ecology and about reverence for those species of birds and invertebrates and soil microorganisms, the whole system. So what it does is it looks at a credit system similar to LEED that people can look at criteria in their site selection, site development, and understand what kind of capacity the place has to support biodiversity and ecological function, not only the capacity, but also how we can measure and monitor that in the future. It is a part of these incentive-based programs. For instance, I've been working with the Department of Environment in San Francisco, a wonderful organization that's looking at expediting a permit process for those projects that have living roofs or stormwater management or other green measures, which means savings of time and energy and money.
So this would be similar to LEED, except it takes into account if the project helps support biodiversity, it would be rewarded.
Absolutely, and restores natural process and ecological functions. So what we're looking for is we need to build some resilience into our natural systems, and that's kind of what we've taken away when we pave over a large area and change climatic patterns through urban heat island, interrupt migratory patterns. We've reduced the amount of resilience the environment has for recovery. We've lost our metabolic immune system.
Paul, what would I know for LEED standards it's platinum and it's silver and gold, and they don't have aluminum, right? I don't know, but what does?
It's interesting that they've selected minerals But for LEAF, leadership and ecological applications and functions, the awards are the oak leaf award, the maple, the sycamore, and the willow.
Now, have you gotten far in your LEAF standards?
Well, I'm working on the LEAF standards now, and I'm working with Natural Logic, and we're starting to introduce the topic, and people are interested, and planners are interested, and architects are interested, and I think the landscape architecture profession in particular will benefit from this, and landscape architecture, which really is responsible for kind of the ground plane and how our plants and our landscapes have been envisioned within the urban fabric. Really, it's landscape architecture that's responsible for the ornamental landscapes that we have. And that came from a school in the 60s of kind of abstract expressionism and pattern and color and texture. And as the landscape architectural profession progressed, more diversity and color and functions started to occur within the design. And now I see landscape architecture as evolving to look at ecology as a main criteria for design. And so I think landscape architects will benefit from having a LEAF criteria where they can look at grading and soil and the hydrology and geology and as a part of the siting as well as a part of what is the capacity for a particular site to support particular butterflies or hummingbirds or other organisms.
So, Paul, it sounds like really you're almost like a voice for nature in this world of architecture and planning. And what has this experience been like for you?
I am fortunate to work with very passionate, brilliant teams of people from all over the world that are dedicated to superior, just wonderful design, magnificent projects like the California Academy of Sciences with Renzo Piano's group and Gordon Chong. These are just wonderful people to work with, and it brings me a great deal of optimism that many people in the industry, in the architectural industry, and the land use planning world are focusing their work and redirecting their work towards an ecological approach. And so it's very gratifying. I've worked with wonderful staff here at Rana Creek and very smart, articulate young people that are very passionate about the work they do. And so it gives me a great deal of satisfaction.
What are some of your favorite projects that you're working on right now?
Well, actually, there's been a couple of recent projects that I've worked with, just some monumental projects with charismatic and brilliant architects like Bill McDonough and with his group, and L&M in Seattle, and Renzo Piano's group. But recently I've been working on some smaller community projects that are, for instance, the First Community Housing in San Jose that's a nonprofit, or the Council District 9 headquarters in Los Angeles. These are municipal projects or community-driven projects, and they're Main Street projects. So they're short lifetime structures. They're not monumental architecture. They're projects that are on Main Street, and that's what's so encouraging to me, is that when we can develop sustainable measures for everyone in communities and residential applications and developments, that's when we're going to win.
That's what I enjoyed at the Green Roof Symposium, where you were talking about that project in Los Angeles, and it just seemed the most community-oriented to me of all the ones that were mentioned that day.
Yeah, well, that particular area is impoverished, and they have some social problems with crime and disenfranchised a bit. And the work that we are doing with the city and Paul Murdoch's architects group really looks at how to improve the community through encouraging biodiversity and ecology in a healthy environment first. And people respond to that. People love to be in a place where there's healthy soil and clean water and fresh air. Those are the basics.
Yeah, and we all deserve that.
That's a key issue we're dealing with on a global basis. as China and these other emerging worlds start to develop, the populace want the kind of lifestyles that are based on consuming a great deal of not only resources, but particularly protein from a food source group, but also energy and oil and consumer goods, manufactured goods. This puts a tremendous pressure on our world's resources.
Well, Paul, with all of this going on, including what you just mentioned, how do you remain optimistic, and what is your vision for the future?
Well, I remain optimistic because of the people that I work with and because of the examples I'm seeing. And this isn't necessarily technology-driven. Design is a creative process, and it's artistic. And I don't know if technology, I know that comes from art and design, but I think what we're seeing now is more of an awakening or enlightenment, if you will, towards the environment and these environmental issues. So that's what I see emerging, particularly in the North America, and it gives me a great deal of satisfaction to be doing this work and hope for the future. And I would like to see, I guess if you look at in my short lifetime, if we can launch some examples and demonstrations of how our culture and society can work with nature and incorporate ecology as a part of the experience here, and that to me will be success, and I think I'll fulfill a childhood dream to work with nature and ecology, and that's kind of what I see as the future for the next 40 years.
That sounds like a wonderful future. And Paul, if you could give some advice to people about one or two actions that they could take to ensure that there is a place for invertebrates, birds, plants, and what would they be? What would be one?
It's all about the water. Mm-hmm. We need to have, it's three basics. We need to have fresh, clean water and healthy soil and fresh air. And so if we can encourage maintaining, capturing, and slowing water on our sites and around our houses and our structures, that'll help provide a greater amount of diversity and utilization by creatures. Also, I think important is the use, try to decrease the reliance on inorganic pesticides and chemicals, and there are organic standards and there's integrated pest management standards that help people understand how to manage their landscapes and their open space around them.
So basically it's really keeping our watersheds clean and air too.
Yeah, we want to if we create a healthy environment for little butterflies and little invertebrates, that's as simple as it gets. Then we will be the benefactors of that environment we create for them.
Mm-hmm. We're actually creating the environment for ourselves, too.
Yeah, well, that's the problem, is we always focus on ourselves. And the part of this process is start to not look at what's in it for us, but what's in it for all the other creatures we share the place with. Once we do that, and if you look at those indigenous peoples and civilizations around the world, for instance, the indigenous peoples that lived on the Pacific coast lived sustainably for 30,000 years within their watersheds based on a salmon totem ecology. And that's because they had a reverence for their food source and their soil and their plants and their trees.
Do you think that this reverence is something that can be taught if people have kind of grown up without that?
Well, it's easy. Let's go back to the example of the man that grew up in Los Angeles. He just couldn't express how wonderful it was to be so privileged in his community to have a little piece of backyard with a lawn. So once people have that experience, it's pretty easy to do.
Paul, I would love, I wanted to get contact information from you, but before we go, we only have about a minute left. I would love for you to tell our listeners about your party principle. And you mentioned that at the Green Roof Symposium, and I really enjoyed that.
Well, art and science is okay, but we also have to have a little fun. And it's a way in which people can reconnect with ecology. And I think that having parties on the land is an important ritual, and people aren't connected with the land. So I've developed a scientific study that looks at 3 levels of parties on roofs with seeding methods that will result in various levels of plant communities established and ecological function. So I'm taking somewhat of a scientific study and having some fun with it, and looking at different intensities and frequencies of parties, and seeing how people, when they're on the land and connected to the land, what kinds of results in biodiversity occur.
So is it the more intense the party, the more intense the biodiversity?
Well, perhaps. When you look at intensity of disturbance regimes in nature, things like Mount St. Helens and the Yellowstone fire, as devastating as they are short episodic disturbances that result in high levels of biodiversity and function. So my feeling is, if we took a vacant lot and everybody had some seed, and we put on some music and we broadcasted seed and danced that seed into the ground, it probably would result in a riotous mass of flowers after we left.
Is that what spontaneous vegetation is?
Well, spontaneous vegetation actually happens without us, but this is to help assist in that establishment of new vegetation and plant communities.
Now, have you done this? Have you done the party principle with on these living roofs that you have been telling us about?
No, but I've done it on the ground plane, and having little drum circles and broadcasting seed is a nice ritual. And it's a wonderful way for people, and children especially. I've done this with school children, having big puppet shows and costumes, and all the school kids get some seed, and we go out in little spots where there's some soil, and we broadcast those seeds, and the kids dance around on the seeds, and then they come back, and they witness that place, that their experience there and presence resulted in all these wonderful flowers and grasses and butterflies, and it was because they were there that occurred.
What a wonderful experience.
Well, you got to have some fun too, and we want to have joy and have a good time while we do this work.
Paul, thank you so much for this interview, and if you could give our listeners your contact information in case they would like to talk to you further or read more about your Rana Creek.
Well, our website is www.ranacreek.com, and I can be reached anytime at paul@ranacreek.com. And we're in Carmel Valley. Our phone number is 831-659-3820. And we also are dedicated to public education and working with people on their projects.
Well, thank you so much for this hour, and I would love to do another interview and get more in depth on these other topics that we just started skirting at the end.
Great. Thank you so much. I very much appreciate this.
Oh, thank you. You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. For more information or to hear our other podcasts or interviews, visit www.sustainableworldradio.com. Sustainable World Radio is produced by Jill Cloutier. Music by Dana Lyons. Thanks for listening.